just begin with why this topic. Most Americans became aware of global jihad very dramatically on the morning in California of September 11, 2001. But it had been percolating for about a decade and a half before that date. And of course, we're all aware of things that have happened since then, with the formation of ISIS, for example, and other things. So this has been this movement that's been around since the 1980s, and it's quite different from the kind of jihadism that we saw in the Middle East and elsewhere in the Muslim world for a number of years before then, which was small groups aiming to overthrow their government, to create some version of an Islamic state, typically. So we all remember, for example, the assassination of Anwar Sadat in 1981. That was, again, one of these small groups. I'll actually have the picture of the leader of that group here in a few minutes. That, again, had local complaints. I mean, they were violent groups. They used violence. They thought it was necessary to use violence to achieve their political ends. But there were a lot of these kind of local groups out there, and there's lots of stuff that's written about them. But what you saw in the 1980s was the emergence from that of a very globally focused series of groups, what I refer to as 4 waves or 4 iterations of global jihad since the 1980s. So I thought this topic really hasn't been approached, at least not the way I'm thinking about it, which is why, even though I've been teaching courses at NPS on what we used to call Islamic fundamentalism for many, many years, since the early 90s, in fact, this was something different. I thought this would be kind of the way I was approaching it was a unique way, and I think would bring a lot of understanding. So that was the motivation for, even though I was following this movement for a long time, got a sabbatical, sat down, and wrote the book with the material I had collected over the years. All right. I sometimes refer to my misspent youth, but I do that in a joking way. I've been involved with the Middle East and the broader Muslim world since I was an 18-year-old exchange student to Iran. Here I am with my Iranian host family in Karaj, just west of Tehran, in 1978, which, as you remember, was kind of an interesting year to be in Iran in 1978. And then I spent a lot of time living and studying in the region. I used to sleep on top of the Great Pyramid in Giza on a fairly regular basis when I was studying in Cairo. This is my student ID from when I was at Yarmouk University in Jordan as well in the mid-1980s. So I spent a lot of time in the region, and so I come to this topic and other topics with sort of an empathy for the regular folks in the region with whom I have lived and befriended for many, many decades. So in this book, I make two broad arguments. The first is sort of a descriptive argument, and it's to take these 4 iterations of global jihad, very distinctive iterations of global jihad, and sort of lay them out for the reader. And the book is really meant for people like you, sort of well-educated, interested non-specialists. So you don't have to be an Arabic speaker or what have you to hopefully enjoy the book. And basically make the argument in a descriptive way that there have been 4 very distinctive iterations or forms of global jihad since the 1980s, since it began in the 1980s. This is a new movement. Even sort of local jihad in many ways is a fairly new movement as well. One can talk about historical parallels from centuries before, but sort of the modern contemporary version of these things, particularly global jihad, is again a quite new thing. We'll talk more about that in a minute. For these 4 waves or 4 iterations of global jihad, they all focus on the international system. That's the problem. They identify different parts of the international system or different issues with the international system. But it's not just overthrowing the local ruler or grabbing a little patch of land that somebody you don't like is occupying. This is a global systemic argument in each of these 4 cases. So I'll go over those briefly today. And the second argument I make tries to answer the so what question. how do we, okay, so there are these guys that have been doing these things over the last 4 decades. How do they compare with the broader universe of violent political movements that we've seen over the last century? And here I make a very provocative argument, what I call, drawing on work that Ken Jowett did, movements of rage. And through that lens, you can make, I think, some very interesting and worthwhile comparisons to both religious and secular very violent groups that we've seen over the last century, here and there. Not a lot of them, but there is a nice handful that we can compare to. And so I will talk about nihilistic violence. So nihilism not in the sense of meaninglessness, the philosophical sense, but in the old Russian anarchists would talk about nihilism as being system-destroying violence, over the top, root and branch violence. So that's the way I use it here. So I'll talk about nihilistic violence, apocalyptic ideology, end times. We are entering the end of the world, essentially, and around the corner there'll be some version of nirvana, and this is true for both religious and typically Maoist movements of rage, and a sociology of marginality. In other words, the leadership and a lot of the base are not national elites at the center of power and economy. They typically are well educated, the leaders are, but from parochial cities, marginal cities, not the capital city, and there's this sort of an enragement from that marginality. To project from the American experience, these are folks that would sometimes be in what some folks refer to as flyover states, right? And they're mad about that marginality. So anyway, we'll get to those comparisons later. All right, so I begin with the precursors, with what was happening in the Muslim world, again, primarily the Middle East, earlier in the 20th century. And here I basically said, look, there are 3 steps along the way that are really important. The first step is, the first bullet point there, is the creation of what we call Islamism. Again, we used to call Islamic fundamentalism, political Islam, Islamism. Again, this is a very modern movement. We can talk about what makes it modern, but it's very much a part of mass society that's getting created in the late 19th and then into the 20th century in the Middle East. This fellow on the top right is widely considered the founder of Islamism in the Muslim world. His name is Hassan al-Banna. He was an Egyptian school teacher who actually taught in Ismailia in the Suez Canal zone. And he was the one that founded the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Muslim Brotherhood is the most famous Islamist organization in the world, and there are different branches of it in different countries. And in countries that don't have a formal Muslim Brotherhood branch, there will be some party that is like it. Urban middle class, modernist, but in an Islamic format party of some sort or another. But the Muslim Brotherhood itself was formed in 1928. The second step along the way is in the 60s and 70s, and it was prompted primarily by the failure of Islamism, the failure of the Muslim Brotherhood and like-minded groups to seize power, even in sort of democratic or peaceful means, and to create an Islamic state of some sort or another. And there's no agreement about what this Islamic state is supposed to look like. You ask 5 people, you'll get 10 answers. So there were a number of people that arose mostly in the 60s, early 70s, that made the argument and created this sort of intellectual architecture for violence, saying we can't get to where we want to go. We cannot create an Islamic state of one sort or another through nonviolent socio-political movements, creating parties and khairiyat, charitable societies, and these sorts of things. We need to use violence. It's only through the use of violence. Otherwise, the state will block us at every point, as they have for the previous decades. They argued. So we need to employ violence against the state in order to seize power in many cases. So it's probably the two most famous people that made that kind of an argument. This one here, most famously, anybody recognize him? This is Said Qutb, an Egyptian school teacher. There's a tendency here, a trend. Said Qutb was hanged in 1966 by the Egyptian government of Gamal Abdel Nasser for, there was pretext charges, but essentially for writing this little book called Ma'alim fi Tariq, signposts along the road, or milestones, as it's often been translated, which was essentially for jihadis what Lenin's "What is to be done" was for socialists, or for Leninists, more precisely. And Said Qutb was a very prolific author. He wrote a lot of stuff. Probably about half of it or so has been translated into English. So if you're interested, there's a lot of stuff on Said Qutb out there. One of the more interesting facts is his radicalization came gradually. It did not happen overnight. And his first real step along the path of radicalization occurred in the late 40s and early 50s when he was living in Greeley, Colorado. Which was a dry town. It was a planned community temperance, it was a dry town at the time. But he was absolutely appalled by the sort of overflowing hormones and sexuality that was occurring at church dances and these sorts of things in the couple of years that he lived there. He also spent some time elsewhere, including, my book is published by Stanford University Press, so I need to say it, he also spent time at Stanford. So there you have it. And you probably all recognize this fellow here, Ayatollah Khomeini. Khomeini in the Shia world, or Shiite world, if you will, and Said Qutb in the Sunni world. It's, Protestants and Catholics, essentially. We can talk about that if you'd like. They were making very similar arguments about injustice, about oppression, zulm, the arbitrary use of power by pharaoh-like rulers that are not, do not answer to God's law, as they would say, and so, especially in the Egyptian context, accusing a ruler of being a pharaoh is a very loaded insult, as opposed to being Moses, a man of God's law. That's a sort of this dichotomy that you see a lot. So the arguments they were making were quite different in the sense of the vocabulary that they used, right? Khomeini using Shia-laden vocabulary, Qutb using Sunni-laden vocabulary, but both making arguments about social justice in their minds, about oppression, about the rule by illegitimate leaders that have turned their backs on Islam in their views. And they both conclude that it is likely impossible, they didn't close the door entirely, but likely impossible to achieve their ends, again, to create a truly Islamic state without the use of violence. That violence has become necessary given what the state will do if you try and do it through peaceful means. All right, so those are the first kind of two big steps. In the 1980s, you have this third step along the way, which is the rise of globally based jihadism. Again, not local. I mean, both of these guys were talking about overthrowing their local regimes in Iran, in Egypt. They were not making a globalist argument of any note. But in the 80s, you had that now. You had a number of people, here are two that I'll cover today, who essentially argued that the international system itself is the problem. It's not one regime here or another regime there. It's the system in which they live that is the real problem, and that is where they accept the necessity of violence, and they want to direct it at the international system or representatives of the international system if they can. Now, one final point here is all of these folks are from the dominant Sunni majority. The Sunnis make up about 85% of all the Muslims in the world. So it's by far the largest sect of Islam is in the Sunni community. But it's interesting that there has not been a Shia global jihad movement of any significance at all. We can talk about why that is if you'd like. Again, plenty of jihadi thought from Khomeini and others that you see in today, in Hezbollah, for example, and other groups. But it's not globally based. It's a locally focused, as more traditional jihad, as it were. So, as I said, I go through four waves, four iterations of global jihad. The first one begins in the 1980s, and it begins in Afghanistan. Afghanistan plays a major role in the whole global jihad movement, as I'm sure all of you, that wouldn't surprise any of you. Soviet Union invades Afghanistan in the very last week of 1979, occupies Afghanistan through 1987. There was a major pushback by the Afghans themselves, the so-called Mujahideen, but there was also, over time, it didn't take off right away, but over time, there was an active recruitment of other young Muslim men to come to Afghanistan to fight alongside the Afghans to try and expel the Soviet occupiers from Muslim lands. Probably the most famous of all of the ideologues of the 1980s of the Afghan Jihad is this fellow here. You see him at the bottom and at the top, Abdullah Azzam, Abdullah Yusuf Azzam, the Imam of Jihad, for any of you that read Arabic, the preacher of Jihad. Azzam was a Palestinian who grew up mostly, he was actually born while there was still a Palestine, British Mandatory Palestine. Grew up primarily, like lots of Palestinians did, in the East Bank, so on the east side of the Jordan River in the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. He was actually a preacher at the University of Jordan just a few years before I went there and studied for a year. And he was still talked about. He was this very charismatic presence, a very fiery orator, quite smart. You can actually, he didn't speak English, but just to get a sense of him, there are YouTube videos of Azzam, and you can get just listening to it, you can get a sense of the man if you look him up on YouTube. He was unusual in that he was a cleric. He was a trained cleric. He got his doctorate from Al-Azhar in Cairo. Al-Azhar Seminary and University is, it's like, the Harvard of the Middle East. It is a very reputable, renowned institution. Again, it's both a seminary and a university. So he had these credentials of being a cleric, which is very unusual for jihadi groups. Both local jihadi groups and global jihadi groups rarely have clerics of any note, of any rank, and they might have some minor clerics, but significant clerics avoid these guys like the plague. It's always been the case. So the fact that you had a genuine cleric that was such an important player in the Afghan Jihad of the 1980s was unusual. So Azzam had a number of innovations, but I want to talk about that second one, the Jihadi International. And this is not a translation, but I try and capture the meaning of this Arabic phrase, Qaida Sulba. Qaida Sulba. So Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda, right, Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, this is where it comes from. Qaida Sulba means solid base or cornerstone, solid cornerstone. So Al-Qaeda means the base or the cornerstone. Sulba means solid. This was this very common phrase amongst Afghan jihadis and their visitors like Azzam during the 1980s, and what it meant was territory, and specifically meant that once we defeat the Soviet Union and drive them out of Afghanistan, we will then have this solid base, this cornerstone territory of Afghanistan from which we can do other things in the world. Again, not much agreement about what that was to be. But they all use this phrase, and Azzam himself used this phrase to mean territory, to mean Afghanistan after the liberation from the Soviets. As the 1980s wore on, and basically beginning 1986, late 85 into 1986, Azam started to rethink what this phrase meant. His sort of most comprehensive rethink was in April of 1987, when this got published here, by the same title, Qaeda Soba. It's not been translated, unfortunately. It really should be. And he makes an argument that Al-Qaeda Soba should be understood in a different way. It should be understood, and now this is my term, as a jihadi international. Right? You all remember the Communist International, right? The Comintern, the 19-teens is when it's established, 20s, 30s. It didn't amount to much, but what it was supposed to do was to create a pious, in a socialist, Leninist way, a pious warrior class that would help communities throughout Europe and beyond to overthrow their oppressors, which, of course, for the Comintern was the bourgeoisie, right? So the bourgeois repression. So this warrior class would go from country to country to help the locals overthrow this dominant class and bring about social justice as a result. This is essentially his argument, but not for Leninists or socialists, but for Muslims or jihadis in particular. And he says, look, the Soviets occupy Afghanistan, and we're fighting and we're getting pretty close to winning at this point in time. We need to think about how to liberate other occupied lands, right? He said, look, Afghanistan is not the only Muslim land that is occupied. And this was his thing that he was really focused on, was the occupation of Muslim lands. He said, well, look at Palestine, right? That was clearly number 2 on his list after Afghanistan, himself being a Palestinian. But then look everywhere else. Look at that time, the 5 Central Asian republics that were all ruled from Moscow at the time. Look at Kashmir in northern India, ruled by the Hindus in New Delhi. Look at Mindanao in the southern Philippines, ruled by Catholic Manila. So he would rattle off about a dozen or so places around the world that he said, look, these are historically Muslim lands that still have large Muslim populations. We need to create this pious warrior class that will go from Palestine to Kashmir to Mindanao and other places to help the local Muslim community liberate themselves. All right, so it's very much a Communist International argument, but with a green flag instead of a red flag. Again, there are other things that we can talk about. Jihad as permanent revolution is sort of an interesting thing for me as a political scientist. I date this to 1990. 1979, when the Soviets invaded, although this idea really didn't start percolating until the mid-'80s. But 1990, 2 things happened. One, actually, in late 1989, November of 1989, Azam is assassinated in Peshawar, Pakistan, by unknown assailants. Nobody has claimed credit. We all have our suspicions. I have mine. But we can't ascertain with 100% certainty who killed him. So the leader of this argument is now dead. And on August 2nd, 1990, Iraq invades Kuwait. Abdullah Azam's colleague in Afghanistan, a fellow by the name of Osama bin Laden, you may have heard of him, he was still on good terms with the Saudis. He comes from a very prominent Saudi family from Yemeni background. And he said to the Saudis, saying, look, don't bring in the Americans and these other infidels to liberate Kuwait. Let's do the Jihadi International. Let's do the Azam model, or the Afghan model, if you will. Let me, Osama bin Laden, raise 100,000 mujahideen, 100,000 warriors from around the Arab world, and we will drive out the Iraqis from Kuwait that way instead. As you might imagine, the Saudis politely declined. This was a big step in bin Laden's radicalization, by the way, which he was, up to that point, much more of a traditional jihadi, but that started him thinking about what's the matter with the Saudi royal family. Why won't they go along with this idea of using Muslims to liberate occupied Muslim lands as opposed to infidel Americans and their allies? All right, so that's the first wave. It mostly comes to an end, again, with his assassination and with the lack of its practical use when it was turned down for use in Kuwait in 1990. You can always find a few true believers out there, but essentially the wind in its sails had mostly dissipated as a result. The second wave is Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, that most Americans, of course, are very familiar with. The crisis that is driving the second wave is not occupied Muslim lands. This was not much of a concern for bin Laden. It was the durability of these apostate regimes in Egypt and Saudi Arabia and elsewhere that he thought, once you assassinate Sadat or do this or do that, these regimes should crumble. But they don't crumble. Why don't they crumble? Why are they so much more durable than I thought they would be? So bin Laden goes to this fellow, and that fellow is Mohammed Abdussalam Faraj, or Farag, if you will, the Egyptian pronunciation. This is the leader of the group that killed Anwar Sadat in 1981. In the 2 years prior to that assassination, he wrote this little book here, Farid al-Ghaiba, 60-some-odd page, extended memorandum, really, to his followers. This was not for general education in the society. This was to his followers. And one of the interesting arguments he makes in Farid al-Ghaiba, the hidden obligation or the missing duty. And what was that hidden duty or hidden obligation that wasn't being used? Armed jihad. Armed jihad. Violence for social good. And one of the things that Faraj argued was that jihadis should not waste their time focusing on the far enemy. And who was the far enemy for Faraj? It was Israel. Jihadis should not waste time focusing on Israel because, that's a hard nut to crack. And even if we have success, the local regimes will claim credit and take the credit away from us. So this is not, we have only a limited amount of resources. Let's focus, we need to focus our resources on overthrowing the near enemy, not the far enemy. Who was the near enemy was the Egyptian regime, was Anwar Sadat in that case, which is why they focused their energies on ultimately successfully assassinating Anwar Sadat. And at the same time, this is often forgotten, trying to stage a coup to not just kill Sadat, but to grab the reins of power through a military cell that they had as well. That didn't go over very well. It did not succeed like the assassination succeeded. All right, so again, there are a number of what I call ideological innovations, but it's the far enemy one, Abu Baid, right there, that is the most important one. And this is where bin Laden goes to the now hanged Faraj, goes to his work and says, look, Faraj had it pretty close to right. He has this nice dichotomy that he created about near enemy, far enemy, but he has it exactly wrong about what should be the preference. Who should we target first? And for bin Laden, it wasn't the near enemy. The near enemy was a kind of a secondary part of the larger problem. The real problem was the United States. Because every time the local regime, this local apostate regime would be weakened in some way, it was the United States that would come in and save the day, would save the regime. If you take away the U.S. from the equation, if you drive them out of the region, so they want nothing to do with the Middle East or the broader Islamic world, then next time you punch the regime in the face, it will fall and it will stay over. I liken his strategic vision to, you remember those old Bobo dolls? I had a Bobo doll when I was a kid. So they were usually dressed up as clowns, plastic with a weight in the bottom. And you'd punch them and they'd fall down, but then they'd bounce right back up again because of that weight in the bottom, right? So they were great fun. And that was kind of his strategic vision. You could punch the Bobo doll in the face, the local regime, you can assassinate ministers and this and that. You can do various things, but it will always right itself because of that alliance with the United States. And not the West, the US. He was very specific about that. Once you remove the weight from the bottom of the Bobo doll, by the way, he'd never use this analogy, this is my analogy. Once you remove the weight from that Bobo doll, when you punch the regime in the face the next time, it will go down and it will stay down. Right? So this was his strategic vision, one that other jihadis thought was nuts. Right? He got all kinds of criticism within the jihadi community, including from a guy I'll mention here in a minute, Abu Musab al-Suri, for essentially creating enemies, creating more enemies than you already have. Why would you bring the weight of the U.S. military down on these jihad groups in Afghanistan if you didn't have to? Right? I mean, this was just sort of strategic stupidity in the eyes of a lot of his fellow jihadis. All right. So again, the heyday of it's America first, right? Drive the Americans out. That's your first obligation, and once you do that, then the local regimes will fall, which is your real target. These local near-enemy regimes. It's really a very short-lived period when it was at the sort of the height of its powers. It's really 1998 to 2001. 1998 with the East African bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, which killed a lot of Africans primarily. And then, of course, 2001 with the 9/11 attacks in the United States, and in between the attack on the coal in Aden Harbor in Yemen. He has two kind of really important documents from the 90s. In 1996, he has this long extended, it started as a speech actually in the Hindu Kush in Afghanistan when he first left Sudan to go to Afghanistan. We'll get into that. In 1998, he issues a fatwa, a religious opinion, which he's not qualified to do, he's not a cleric. And here's just an announcement of it. Bin Laden's Ayman al-Zawahiri, also recently dead. Rafat Taha, who's another jihadi in Egypt, issue a fatwa to kill Americans fi kulli makan, in any location, anywhere in the world. When I talk about system-destroying violence, it's really over-the-top kind of violence. Remember this call, right? This is a call for the mass murder of over 300 million people. Right? So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. All right, 2011, Al-Qaeda Central, as it was often called, of Bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, and those folks in the AFPAC, the Afghanistan-Pakistan region, was a hollow shell for the most part. It had very little power after about 2003, and by 2011, Bin Laden was killed by U.S. Navy SEALs in Abbottabad, Pakistan. And again, you can always find a few true believers, but this ideology in particular was a hard sell in the Muslim world. It was a hard sell to say, look, you want to potentially sacrifice your life in the cause of driving the Americans out of the region, and then after that we can worry about the local regimes that we all detest. Some people bought into it, but by comparison to the ISIS message, which we'll get to in just a minute, which was much sexier, much more attractive, much more compelling, Al-Qaeda never really recruited very well. They never had that many men under arms. The third wave, the ISIS wave, this is the state-building wave, the caliphate wave, if you will. So again, the crisis is very different. This is not occupied lands, and it's not driving the Americans out of the region to make the local enemy regimes more vulnerable. The near-term crisis was the destruction of the Iraqi state with the American invasion in 2003, and then the subsequent civil war in Syria that created a whole eastern part of the country that was, fair game. Anyway, so there's a lot of that, the kind of regional dynamics, but the bigger picture, the bigger issue was not apostate regimes, or apostate states, if you will. It was apostasy itself. Apostasy itself. In other words, the presence in the Muslim world of rampant sinful behavior. Rampant sinful behavior. how do you create a state that a truly pious Muslim state in the heart of the Middle East, where truly pious Muslim behavior is possible? Again, in their version of what constitutes pious behavior. And this is the job. And again, I'll probably be hit by lightning here, but think of Augustine of Hippo, right? One of the first great Christian theologians from what is today Algeria, North Africa, where he created this dichotomy of city of God, city of man. What was the point of the city of man, of temporal power, temporal earthly authority, was to protect the city of God, to make possible the city of God, so that you could create a truly pious society in which, again, truly pious Christian behavior is possible, without worrying about this, that, or the other thing. So to have a city of man, power, temporal power, that will protect the ability of the city of God to thrive and to prosper. This is essentially what ISIS was about, in terms of its domestic program, was to create as fearsome a state as they could come up with, and they were awfully fearsome, as you know, in order to make a truly apostasy-free society possible. Right? So this is not liberating occupied territory. This is not driving the Americans out. This is state building. This is state building, but a particular and peculiar kind of state building. I don't want to get too academic here, but 1648, Treaty of Westphalia. Anybody ever heard of that? Treaty of Westphalia? I got a few nods there. Good. So the Treaty of Westphalia essentially, because the European states, particularly Germanic states, were fighting each other all the time, and they weren't fighting. I mean, sometimes they were fighting over real things, but often they were fighting over, at least in theory, that my state is the only one that God recognizes. Your state is an affront to God. And they were all making those arguments about each other. So they get together in Westphalia and basically say, look, this is nonsense. We can't do this. We can have wars with each other. That's okay. But we need to recognize the basic legitimacy of states other than just our own. Right? So it sort of creates the rules of the game. Well, we still live in a Westphalian world. Right? We have nearly 200 Westphalian states on planet Earth, and unless you're going to to genocide or something like that, basically your internal concerns are recognized as your internal concerns. Chinese push that. I mean, the Communist Party of China pushes this all the time. This is our internal matters. You have no say on our internal matters in Tibet or whatever. So very Westphalian kind of argument. ISIS was not creating a Westphalian state. It was creating a pre-Westphalian state, where its state was the only state that God recognized, and every other state in the world was an affront to God. Right? So do you remember when ISIS applied for a seat at the United Nations? Never did. Remember when it started exchanging ambassadors with the Saudis and others? Never did. They didn't care about that stuff, right? That's Westphalian state stuff. We're building a pre-Westphalian state where we're the only legitimate state on Earth, and no other state is legitimate in our eyes, and therefore it's fair game to try and undermine in the future. And again, this is by far the biggest of the four waves that I talk about. So it has the most ideological innovations. I, again, don't have time to go through all of them, but pre-Westphalian state building, again, apocalyptic ideology, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Performative violence, all to be seen on the internet, you're aware of that. The longer argument about storytelling being more important than theology, which is kind of interesting. ISIS never spent a lot of time trying to convince major Muslim clerics, the ulama, of the rightness, of the correctness of their theological arguments. And again, just as an example, of all the major clerics, Muslim clerics in the world, how many recognize the caliphate? How many recognize Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi as the new caliph? Zero. Not a one. Not a one. He was seen as a crackpot, just kind of a guy off his meds by the Muslim clergy around the world, the sort of the upper half, the more high-ranking ones. So their focus in terms of recruiting and indoctrinating their fighters was not to focus on theology, where they themselves kind of recognized they were on thin ice, but instead shift to storytelling, sort of heroes in Islamic history and oral traditions about this fight or this battle or what have you that we may or may not have much actual facts on, data on. But that kind of storytelling becoming more important than grounded theological arguments. Anyway, I get into that in the book. The extreme sectarianism, extraordinarily anti-Shia. I mean, it's like, they would, I mean, almost literally say, you know, the Jews are bad enough, but the Shia are worse. And for any of you that have ever heard sort of Salafi-tinged sermons in and around the Arabian Peninsula, they're not very complimentary about Jews in particular, but not Shia either. And for these guys, the Shia were the worst of the worst. Again, even worse than the Jews, the Baha'is, or some of their other sort of classic enemies. I spent some time with this last bullet point because I think it's very interesting. What I call jihadi cool, what anarchists used to call the propaganda of the deed. What Nike would say, just do it. Let your actions speak louder than your words. You don't have to worry about coming up with fine-tuned, you know, theological arguments to counter all the counter arguments and all of that. Just go and do what you want to do, and let that be the ideology. Let that be the propaganda to recruit other folks to the side. And so this is, as I say in the book, this is a bell that can't be unrung. There are a lot of folks that have learned that this is kind of the way to do things, is to go out and sort of do grotesque violence, make sure you upload it on the internet, make sure everybody knows about it, and you're gonna turn off, you know, 95% of the community that you're after, in this case the Muslim community around the world, but there'll be 5% young men that will be, you know, motivated by it. Like, this is really cool. People, young men looking for meaning and excitement in their life, can be turned on to coming and joining your cause by this kind of propaganda of the deed, or jihadi cool. And again, think of, if you're a 19-year-old from the Caucasus or from Manchester or somewhere else, and you come to ISIS, and you're in Iraq, Syria, what can you do? First of all, you get to engage in all kinds of violence, you know, stuff that would put you away for life if you did it in your home country. And it's, again, a lot of it's on film. It gets uploaded on the internet. You can show people what you're doing. It's really cool. You have pretty much unlimited sex, right? The sort of sexual sex slaves, and I mean, not just slaves. I mean, wives, concubines, and sex slaves. They were all part of the sort of general offerings to the fighters of ISIS that the leaders you know, made sure to recruit as much, or to take hostage as much as possible. So if you're, again, a 19-year-old, 20-year-old young man looking for excitement and meaning in life, a lot of them would reject it, but there are some that thought this was super, super cool. And this was, as I said, I think a lesson that has been learned, unfortunately, by a lot of folks. One book that, this one, Idarat al-Tawahush. The Idara just means administration or management. Tawahush means savagery. So the administration or management of savagery. This has been translated into English as management of savagery. So you can actually look it up online if you will. It, like most of the most radical global jihadi books ever written, and tracts ever written, were written in the 2-year period beginning with the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. And this was one of them. And it essentially lays out the use of violence, how violence, performative, over-the-top kind of violence, can be used to gain control. Well, to first take a territory and put it into what they call a gray zone, so the state doesn't really control it fully, and then you can use that same violence to take control of that parcel of land that you're interested in. And you can use that same kind of violence to keep social control in the absence of state institutions until you have developed institutions of the state to maintain social control that way. And just to give you an example of how that worked in real life. Remember when Mosul fell? When about 300 ISIS fighters came to the city of Mosul in northern Iraq, and there were a lot more regime troops that were there, and the regime troops just left. Just left. As soon as the ISIS fighters were in town, they did a couple of killings, including a very gruesome one on this jeep right on the edge of Mosul. Put it on the internet. All the other soldiers in Mosul saw it very quickly, and they got out of Dodge. They left very quickly. So this was an example of the sort of violence that is laid out in this book being put to use. Of saying this is the way you can take, you can grab control of the territory, because the soldiers don't want to go through what you're doing to folks. And so they left instead. And ISIS then was in control of Mosul, which was their biggest prize in the existence of ISIS. All right. So 2003, 2017, 2003 with the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which creates the dynamic that leads to ISIS. It had some precursors that came out of Jordan, actually, with Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, but that's a longer story. To 2017. What happens in 2017? Both Mosul in Iraq and Raqqa, their sort of nominal capital in Syria, both fall to this combination of American air power and special forces and ground troops, Iraqi army forces in the case of Iraq, Kurdish forces in the case of Syria, and that kind of combination working together was very successful at dislodging ISIS, and it drove them out of territory. So in 2017 was the end of the territorial state. And again, the thing that made ISIS interesting and different was the territoriality. This was, as I said, this was a state-building exercise. If you don't have territory, you don't have a state. And so there is still an ISIS out there, a jihadi group that does some violence from time to time, but it is not what it once was. It's no longer a state, or a state in its own mind, at least. All right, so the fourth wave then, it parallels the beginnings of the third wave, but again, very different reasons and a much longer trajectory out. This, going back to Afghanistan, this fellow here, Abu Musab al-Suri, here you see him with bin Laden. He's oftentimes referred to as an Al-Qaeda ideologue or thinker, and that's not really true. He's very much a free agent. He came out of Syria. He was involved in the early 80s with the first attempt to try and overthrow the Assad regime in Syria that failed. He escaped to Spain, married a Spanish woman, and then spent time in London as well. He's the guy that arranged a very famous interview that Peter Bergen had with Osama bin Laden, in fact, when he was based in London. He's the guy that calls bin Laden a pharaoh, extraordinarily critical of bin Laden. He's thought that the whole America First strategy and the attacks on 9/11 were absolutely stupid. And would come back to haunt the global jihad movement, and he thought he was very much right as a result of the destruction of 2001, 2002 of pretty much all the global jihadi leadership in Afghanistan that were either killed or arrested or on the run and hiding somewhere. So its power, its ability to project power just went downhill all of a sudden. So he was a very big critic of bin Laden, and he's worried about the survival of the global jihad movement itself that had made, in his mind, a number of strides over the years. But he's now concerned that it's going to perish. That now with the Americans and their allies full on after global jihadis everywhere, and even local jihadis to a large degree, the movement itself is going to be defeated. It's going to just be so brutalized that it won't be able to recover for a long, long time. So he thinks about a strategy of how to live to fight another day. What can we as global jihadis do now when we're very weak and we're on the cusp of defeat? What kind of strategy can we utilize that will maintain our presence and hopefully rebuild our forces over time? So that was his challenge, and this was his answer. Da'wat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya al-Alamiyya, the call for global Islamic resistance, muqawama. Not jihad, it's muqawama, resistance. This is a 1,600-page internet book. It's never been translated into English. It is very repetitive. There's a lot of cut and paste from earlier essays that he wrote. There's chapter 8 actually has been translated quite well, actually, by Brynjard Lea. And that's sort of sufficient, I think, if you're interested in following up on Abu Suri. His basic argument can be captured in this, the Arabic is on top, Nizam la Tanzim. Nizam la Tanzim. Any of you speak a Semitic language, Arabic or Hebrew or Aramaic or others, will recognize this is a play on words, right? The three consonants, those two words come from the same root. So it's kind of a play on words, Nizam la Tanzim, meaning system, not organization. So he was advocating to create a system, not an organization. In fact, he does a survey in one of his chapters in the book of all these jihadi groups from the 1960s on. So this was, for the last 40 years at the time. And he said, look how easy it was for all of them to be defeated, to be rolled up. Right? States, local security forces just need to arrest one or two guys, torture them, they'll spill the beans, and they'll go arrest the other guys, they'll torture them, they'll spill more beans, and just like that, fellas, it's done. It's the group is gone. So how do you create not an organization that can be rolled up, just like every other one had been rolled up before? How do you create a system that can survive? And again, using, and this is where he brings in 20th century, 21st century now technology, bringing in the internet, and then followers of him bringing in social media that came after he disappeared from the scene in 2005. So he has several things that are really important. The first is the individual jihad, jihad fardi. Individual jihad. This is, basically in English, we know this as the lone wolf attacks. So individuals or small groups of people, like-minded people, that will be connected to other like-minded folks on the internet, learn from them, teach others, etc. And from time to time, somebody implements violence. We don't know who it's going to be, which person, which week, but from time to time, somebody gets motivated to get in his truck and run down a bunch of civilians, or plant a bomb somewhere if you have that technical capacity, or go stab a cop or something. He said, well, we're too weak to have the sort of frontal warfare. We'd lose in an instant. So we have to rely on like-minded individuals and small groups of people that have been radicalized and will carry out the jihad in our name. The media part of it is essential. This is my phrase, the wiki narrative. Sort of uses the term thaqafa in Arabic. Thaqafa just means culture. He doesn't really mean culture the way we understand it. He means a discourse. And the discourse, or the narrative, if you will, it's vulnerable if it's in the hands of one or two or three people. Leaders, top ideologues that can be assassinated. So what you want to do is use the internet to create this narrative that is always evolving. It's always changing. It's always incorporating the most recent attack here, the most recent attack there, this piece of news or that piece of news, to stitch together, again, an always evolving narrative that suggests a power much greater than actual power. It projects a perception of power much greater than actual sort of men under arms kind of power. So the wiki narrative being very important. So he's thinking through of how to use modern technology, modern information technologies. And finally, again, I don't have time to go into it, but he's a strong advocate of violence against civilians. He says, call me a terrorist if you want, I don't mind. But these soft targets are where you get the most bang for your buck. He has been implicated both in Madrid train bombings that killed, I believe, 192 people, and in the 7/7 attacks in England as well, killed a number of people. There is a direct line from Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, and other writings that Fanon did on the Algerian War of Independence against the French in the 50s and early 60s. And the GIA in the 1990s, the Algerian Civil War, and Abu Musab al-Suri, and this kind of call for violence today. And again, I don't have time to go into it now, but if you want to chat about it later, I'll be happy to make that case. All right. This kind of jihad fard, these personal attacks against lone wolf attacks, if you will. The sort of hip social science phrase that I use as well in this book is stochastic violence, stochastic terror. That is just a term of probability. And the idea is, if you have an individual or group that has followers that makes a call to violence, the probability of violence will go up. You just don't know where. Who's going to be motivated? Who's going to be radicalized and inspired by this call to violence? So as sort of law authority folks, that the likelihood of violence has gone up, but you don't know where. So it's a very durable form of violence. It's not a form of violence that overthrows countries, right? This is not killing millions of people or even thousands of people, but it is very durable. It's hard to put out entirely. So it's that system that he was going for, as opposed to an organization, a system that is very hard to put down in its entirety. And if you think about all the jihadi acts of violence in this country over the last decade and a half, they've all been of this stochastic nature. That is, autonomous violence undertaken by individuals or small numbers of people that were motivated to do it. Calls to violence by others, but no logistical connection, no payment, no training, no chat on the internet with each other. These were people that you couldn't know that it was going to be them that got radicalized and undertook violence. So the Boston bombing, for example, the two brothers, the Pulse nightclub bombing in Florida that killed about 50 folks. This is the Central Asian fellow in New York City that got this truck and then run over a bunch of bicyclists, actually tourists, foreign tourists primarily. The San Bernardino couple that shot up the holiday gathering. As far as we know, none of the perpetrators of these acts of violence had any connection at all with Al-Qaeda, with ISIS, or any other group. This was all autonomously done violence, inspired by others, but autonomously undertaken. So who's this fellow, you're wondering? Anybody know?
No.
This is Tom Metzger. Tom Metzger died 2 years ago. He lived in Fallbrook in San Diego for many years. He was arguably the most radicalized white supremacist in the U.S. He was so radical that the KKK kicked him out. I kid you not. And he went off to form the Aryan Nation and other groups. I mean, he was very much a race warrior in the use of violence. He and one of his colleagues, and I said he just died a couple of years ago, he and one of his colleagues, when the internet was really coming on the scene in the 1990s, were the first people to think about how can we use this new technology to spread hate? I mean, to spread the message in a way that's not going to get us thrown in jail. He was not always successful at that, by the way. But so there's plausible deniability. We're inspiring people to go undertake the kind of violence we want them to do, but without directing them to do that, without paying them, without having any kind of logistical tie to them at all. So you can't blame us for it. Right? So Metzger was the first guy to kind of think through how the internet can be used for this kind of violence. And again, the sort of violence today we refer to as stochastic violence or stochastic terror when it's directed at civilians. It normally is. All right, let me just take a couple of minutes to ask the so what question. So here are these four phases. The first three are pretty much done. The fourth phase is still ongoing, and it's very durable, but it's not a huge strategic threat on the order of Russia or China or any of the sort of big issues out there. But it's going to murder people from time to time. How do we think about these global jihad groups in the larger universe of violent non-state actors over the last century or so? And I'm purposely putting state actors to the side here, so I'm looking at non-state actors. I make the argument that the vast majority, in fact, of violent political movements, non-state political movements over the last century, all have at their core a sense of implementing Enlightenment ideals. Enlightenment ideals of progress, of justice, of science. You look at Leninism, for example, right? That Leninism, sort of a form of communism, as first laid out by Karl Marx. Lenin had a somewhat different take on it, but they viewed themselves as the tip of the spear of human progress. That they were the ones that were implementing a world of social justice where sort of feudalism and the excess of capitalism gets pushed aside and a much more just society emerges. So their self-image was one of they're the torch of human progress in the world. National liberation movements, be it in Vietnam or there's Habib Bourguiba in Tunisia, similarly, right? These are movements post-World War II that were all about freedom, right? Freedom is an Enlightenment value that, you Europeans primarily, are colonizing and repressing us in Algeria or elsewhere in the world, and we want our freedom, and so we will fight for our freedom. And so they have very much an Enlightenment sense about themselves. And then this is a harder argument, but I talk about fascism. Fascism is usually presented as the antithesis of the Enlightenment, right? The reaction to Enlightenment ideals in Europe creates the fascist movement of sort of the Catholic Church and the military and big property owners that unite in opposition to the liberalism that comes out of the Enlightenment, liberalism writ large. But at least an element of fascism emphasizes modernity, emphasizes forward progress, material progress, right? And Mussolini captured it very nicely for me with his quote about that fascism means making the trains run on time, which is still a challenge in Italy, but put that aside. Here's this great poster of the Mussolini himself. This is from 1936, beginning the destruction of the Spina neighborhood, just outside of the Vatican in Rome. Any of you been to St. Peter's Square? And you look down that lovely large boulevard right to the Tiber River, the Castel there on the left. Remember that? That was not your view in 1936. This was your view in 1936. It was a very dense neighborhood. And as part of sort of urban renewal, if you will, and not just in the Spina neighborhood, other neighborhoods as well, but Mussolini just wiped out those old neighborhoods and put in these big boulevards and monuments and this and that. Again, sort of a testament to modern Italian progress, material advancement, and all of that. So at least in that element, I would argue that fascism too shares a sense of their containing Enlightenment ideals. And that is to juxtapose it to, again, using the phrase that Ken Jowett coined, movements of rage. A small number of movements in the last, again, non-state actors in the last century or so, that have nothing to do with Enlightenment ideals. They reject Enlightenment ideals. They don't even make a case for it, even if one they didn't believe in. These are movements that really share three fundamental things. One is a propensity to call for or engage in nihilistic violence. And I said earlier, nihilism in the sense of the Russian anarchists in the last half of the 19th century really talked about this a lot, of system-destroying violence. Just root and branch, get rid of the whole thing, over-the-top violence. Not meaningless, not so nihilo is meaningless in Latin, and so we get philosophical and other traditions of sort of nothingness, of meaningless actions. This is not what I'm talking about. This is not meaningless violence. This is the anarchic, over-the-top violence, system-destroying violence. As opposed to surgical, you kill a few thousand here and that should do the trick kind of violence. Bin Laden's call for the murder of over 300 million Americans would be an example of that kind of call for nihilistic violence. Apocalyptic anti-enlightenment ideology. Apocalyptic here. We are about to go through end times of one sort or another. End times, it's going to be very bloody. We're going to suffer a lot of losses. The other guys are going to suffer a lot of losses. But at the end of the day, around the corner, there is this nirvana. There is this, better society that is awaiting us once we get through the blood purge, if you will. So all of these movements share that kind of apocalyptic ideology. I coined the term gnosis. Gnosis from the Greek meaning knowledge, the Latin suffix side, the killing of knowledge, or the killing of those with knowledge, or the sort of brutal marginalization of those with knowledge. This is what you see in these other movements of rage, is the attack on the best and the brightest in society. Who did the Khmer Rouge, when they killed maybe 2 million people in Cambodia, which is not a big country at the time, who were those that they killed? Urban intellectuals. Right? What was the first thing they did when they came to power was to empty out Phnom Penh. If you wore a tie, wore glasses, spoke a foreign language, even though a lot of the leaders of the Khmer Rouge spoke French, were actually educated in France. Any sign that you were enlightened, any sign that you were not a pure Khmer agrarian worker, meant that you held cultural contamination. Just your very existence was a form of cultural contamination. And so they wiped out. This is when a movement of rage actually came to power. And very dangerous when they do. Other movements of rage, think of the brown shirts in Nazi Germany, right? These were the kind of semi-literate, semi-educated rural thugs that protected the Nazi leadership, Nazi rallies in the 20s and up to 1934. Right, 1934, Hitler's in power now. He didn't need these guys. They were a bit of an embarrassment to him. The Night of the Long Knives, it's called, where he got rid of the brown shirts. The brown shirts were part of a coalition, right? The brown shirts, some of the military officers in Germany, a good chunk of the industrialist class in Germany and the Nazi Party itself were all part of this coalition. The brown shirts of all of those folks were probably the most vicious in their version of gnocicide, of cleansing Germany of cultural contamination, of these folks that were not truly German and brought this kind of contamination to German society. Who were?
Jews.
The Jews primarily. Not only the Jews, but other sort of bad people. Maybe you had handicaps or Down syndrome, or you were a gypsy, Roma, any of these things that made you an inferior human being. You needed to be cleansed. And the brown shirts, more than the other folks in that coalition, had, again, a very, really over-the-top definition of gnosis. And again, the third thing, that sociology of marginality, this notion of, I have been marginalized. I represent the true Khmer, the true Aryan, the true American, the true whatever, and I have been marginalized by these coastal elites, these liberals in the capital city, the whatever. Again, both the leadership and the rank and file of movements of rage tend to come from the margins of society. They don't tend to come from, elite families and elite groups, but marginal groups that have, some ability, have some resources. All right, so again, just some of the other movements of rage. There's not a lot of them, because they tend to be weak and they tend to be put down pretty quickly. If they ever kind of rise up to be a problem, state security forces typically can put them down, but not always. I mean, we do have, I've talked about the Khmer Rouge, the Red Guards in China that Mao co-opted, but in their first couple of years, very much an autonomous movement of rage that directed their rage at university-educated folks, school principals, etc. It led to the back to the countryside policy that ended up killing Again, 2-3 million folks in China as a result. Again, killing the best and the brightest, the best educated folks in the country. Boko Haram, before they sort of got on the global jihad bandwagon, was very much a movement of rage in northern Nigeria. What were their primary targets almost always? Schools, and girls' schools in particular. Boko Haram, there's some debate about the phrase itself. Haram just means forbidden in Arabic. Boko is a word that is used in northern Nigeria to refer to books, but sort of the broader English education that was brought in about a century ago. So those were the schools that were targeted by Boko Haram, and still are to some degree. I talked about the Brown Church in Germany. Here's Charlottesville, elements of the white nationalist movement in the U.S. today. I would also very much define as a movement of rage, and I've probably gone on a little longer than I should. So let me just stop right there and open it up. Anybody have questions or comments? I'm not as convinced as you are, simply because I don't know any of them. There's just you get some news reports about people that scuffle and then they're gone. And in terms of a movement that has some organization, some structure, I guess they haven't crossed that bar in my judgment yet. I mean, they could in the future, but they seem to be pretty sparse at this point. But they could, and I'd have to learn a lot more about what they would believe in if that would be a movement of rage or not. I guess my response is I'm not convinced that that's a major element here. Why? Because it's the kind of prestige, high-end weapon systems that the U.S. sells abroad are thoroughly unusable against this form of political enemy. How are you going to use an F-35 against a jihadi group in Afghanistan or something? I guess you could bomb them, but it's not. In my mind, it's not. I just wrote a chapter actually on military sales to Middle East, North African countries. The book just came out last month, and I look at kind of regime types and why, for example, almost half of all military sales that the U.S. makes to the Middle East, North Africa over the last decade has gone to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. How has Saudi Arabia done in this low-intensity conflict against Iran over the last decade? Not well, right? These top-of-the-line hardware systems don't do very much in the real world in which Saudi Arabia lives. How has these, again, to both the Saudis and the UAE, the Emiratis, how have these sales of high-end weapons helped them in their war of aggression against Yemen, beginning in 2015? Not at all. They've lost, right? They have lost, and now they are basically suing for peace, trying to get some face-saving measure to get out of Yemen. Who did they lose to? They lost to this ragtag group that doesn't have an air force, has very little modern weaponry and technology. They've got some. The Iranians have helped, and others have helped. But it's really a ragtag group, and these high-end military weapons haven't done them any good in a real conflict that they are fighting. So I think there is, in other ways, this big disconnect that's going on. When it comes to movements of rage, I really don't think that that's, at least in the way I look at it, much of an issue. No. There are some popular notions of what credentials somebody would have to be a caliph. Coming from the family of the Prophet, Bani Hashim, you have to make some reasonable argument that you are a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. Now that said, I've been in many Muslim homes in over many years, and there's almost always a genealogy tree. It's a very common ornament particularly in the Middle East households. And I'm telling you, one of those roots of the tree is always Muhammad. Always Muhammad. So, 6 degrees of separation, I suppose. So you have to be related to Muhammad. You have to have some, sort of personal characteristics and what have you. But it's not. It's kind of this. It's a bit of a tricky question. There's not a direct necessity to be related to a descendant of the Ottoman Khalifa, the Ottoman caliphs. In its origins, this became the sort of why we have Sunnis and Shia in the world is over the issue of leadership in the community. And the folks that we call the Shia today basically made this argument about a blood relationship to Muhammad, that the successor to Muhammad should be a blood relative. Ali, his cousin and son-in-law, was a blood relative, and so they wanted him to be the first caliph after the death of Muhammad. They were outvoted by others that said bloodlines shouldn't matter. And the guys that said bloodline shouldn't matter, should be a choice of the community, those are the folks that we call Sunnis today. So the bloodline issue was frankly more important to the Shia traditionally, not to the Sunni when the Ottoman caliphs, of course, were all Sunni. But today, if you look at Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi or his successors, to my knowledge, none of them made a claim to being a direct descendant of one of the more recent Ottoman caliphs out of Istanbul. Sykes-Picot, which is the agreement where Britain and France divvied up the region, and colonialism more broadly was very essential to the founding of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928. So this is it wasn't just about creating a type of society and politics and state that would reflect true Islam, whatever that is. But there was a very strong anti-colonialism rejection of European domination of the region. So, yes. In terms of the creation of Israel, there has been a fair amount of jihadi groups that have developed over the decades. Hamas, probably the most famous one, Islamic Jihad, and others. Those are all locally focused, right? They are about replacing Israel with Islamic Palestine, right? It's not about a global problem. And in fact, one of the interesting things that you'll see is in the writings of a number of the global jihadis, and we'll talk specifically when it comes to Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, they kind of downplay the importance of the whole Israel-Palestine issue. That should not be put up on a pedestal, because that is just a symptom of a much larger problem, which is the far enemy, which for bin Laden was the United States. So we'll talk about that. And so the Israel-Palestine issue needs to be understood as sort of a subservient issue to that broader global problem.